The scream that tore through the winter silence sent every crow fleeing from the skeletal pines. And Dominic Harlow knew without question that someone was about to die in these mountains if he did not move fast. He had been tracking elk through the snow-laden forest of the Sierra Nevada when that desperate cry shattered the December afternoon. And now, his powerful legs carried him down the steep ravine with the surety of a man who had spent 15 years living more with wolves and bears than with other humans. His breath formed white clouds in the frigid air as he crashed through drifts that came up past his knees, his thick buffalo hide coat protecting him from the bite of wind that howled through the canyon. At 32 years old, Dominic stood well over 6 feet tall with shoulders broad enough to carry a full-grown deer, his long dark hair whipping behind him as he ran, muscles honed from a life of chopping wood and wrestling nature itself into submission. The mountains of California in 1878 showed no mercy to the unprepared, and that scream had sounded young and female and absolutely terrified. When he burst through a stand of snow-heavy firs, Dominic found her crumpled against a boulder, shaking so violently that at first he thought she was having some kind of seizure. The woman could not have been more than 22 or 23, with pale skin that had gone nearly blue at the lips and fingertips. Her dress was a thin cotton thing more suitable for a summer picnic than a mountain winter, torn at the hem and soaked through at the bottom where she must have waded through streams. She had no coat, no shawl, nothing but that pathetic dress and a pair of ruined shoes that were more whole than leather. Her dark blonde hair hung in wet tangles around a face that might have been pretty if it was not contorted in such obvious agony. "Please," she gasped when she saw him, her teeth chattering so hard she could barely form the word. "Please help me." Dominic did not waste time with questions. He could see hypothermia claiming her by the second, could see death creeping into her trembling limbs. Without a word, he shrugged out of his heavy buffalo coat and wrapped it around her shoulders. The coat was massive on her small frame, engulfing her completely, but she burrowed into it with a whimper of relief that struck something deep in his chest. "Thank you," she whispered, but her shaking had not stopped. The coat alone would not be enough. "Can you walk?" His voice came out rougher than he intended, gravelly from weeks of disuse. She tried to stand and immediately collapsed. Dominic caught her before she hit the ground, and the feel of her body against his sent alarm bells ringing in his head. She was ice cold, dangerously so. He scooped her up as easily as if she weighed nothing, cradling her against his chest despite the fact that he now wore only his buckskin shirt against the freezing wind. His cabin was 2 miles away, but he had no choice. She would not survive the night out here. "What is your name?" he asked as he began the trek home, needing to keep her conscious. "Penelope," she managed through chattering teeth. "Penelope Zimmerman." "I am Dominic Harlow. Hold on, Penelope. Just hold on." She pressed her face against his chest, and he could feel her breath coming in short, desperate gasps. His own body was already starting to feel the cold without his coat, but he pushed through it, his powerful legs eating up the distance with long, determined strides. The afternoon light was fading fast, turning the snow-covered forest into shades of blue and purple. He knew these mountains like the lines of his own palm, could navigate them blind if he had to, and right now that knowledge was the only thing between this woman and certain death. "How did you end up here?" he asked, partly to keep her talking and partly because he genuinely needed to know if someone was looking for her. "Stagecoach," she said weakly. "Attacked. 3 men. They took everything, threw me out when I tried to fight them, said the mountains would finish me." Rage flared hot in Dominic's gut. He had heard of bandits working these roads, preying on travelers heading to or from Sierra City, but to throw a woman out in winter without even a coat was nothing short of murder. The only reason she was not already dead was sheer luck that he had been hunting nearby. The other passengers, there were no others, just me and the driver, they shot him. Her voice broke. He fell from the seat and they just left him there in the road. Dominic's jaw clenched. He would need to report this to the sheriff in Sierra City, but first he needed to save the woman in his arms. His cabin appeared through the trees like a blessed miracle. A solid structure of thick logs with smoke still wisping from the chimney where he had banked the fire that morning. He kicked the door open and carried Penelope inside, the warmth hitting them like a physical thing. The cabin was sparse but comfortable. A single large room with a stone fireplace, a sturdy bed in one corner, a table and chairs, and shelves lined with supplies. Furs covered the floor and hung on the walls for extra insulation. Dominic laid Penelope on the bed and immediately went to stoke the fire, building it up into a roaring blaze. She was still shaking uncontrollably, her lips blue, her fingers stiff. "We need to get you out of those wet clothes," he said, keeping his voice matter-of-fact despite the awkwardness of the situation. "You will not warm up unless we do." She nodded, understanding the necessity, but her fingers were too numb to work the buttons of her dress. Dominic hesitated only a moment before helping her, his large hands surprisingly gentle, as he unbuttoned the soaked fabric and peeled it away from her skin. He kept his eyes averted as much as possible, focused on the task rather than her body, and wrapped her quickly in every blanket and fur he owned. Then he pulled a chair close to the fire and sat her in it, piling more furs around her. "Your feet," he said, kneeling down to examine them. Her shoes came off in pieces, and he swore under his breath when he saw the state of her feet. They were cut, bruised, and dangerously cold. He filled a basin with lukewarm water and began to carefully warm them, knowing that going too fast could cause more damage. Penelope hissed in pain as feeling started to return to her extremities. Tears streamed down her cheeks, but she did not pull away. Dominic worked in silence, his strong hands careful and methodical as he warmed her feet, then her hands, checking for signs of frostbite. She was lucky. Cold and battered, but she would keep all her fingers and toes. "Why did you give me your coat?" she asked suddenly, her voice steadier now that the worst of the cold was leaving her body. Dominic looked up at her, still kneeling at her feet. "You needed it more than I did." "But you could have frozen. I know these mountains. I know how far I can push before the cold takes me. You did not have that luxury." She studied him with eyes that were a surprising shade of green, like new leaves in spring. Her face was still pale, but color was slowly returning to her cheeks. "You saved my life. Anyone would have done the same." "No," she said quietly. "Those men certainly did not. They laughed when they threw me out, said it would be entertaining to imagine how long I would last." Dominic's hands tightened on the basin. "Do you know who they were?" One of them called another Reese. "That is all I heard. They had bandanas covering their faces." He nodded, filing away the information. There were only so many men named Reese in these parts. It would not be hard to track them down, but that was a problem for another day. Right now, his concern was the woman in front of him. "Are you hungry?" he asked, rising to his feet. Penelope nodded, and Dominic realized she probably had not eaten in however many hours she had been wandering the mountains. He put together a simple meal of salt pork, beans, and cornbread left over from his own breakfast, warming everything over the fire. She ate like she was starving, which she probably was, and he found himself making more just so she could have her fill. "Where were you headed?" he asked as they ate. "Sierra City," she said. "I was supposed to meet my aunt there. She runs a boarding house and offered me a position." I have been traveling from Sacramento for 3 days. Your family knows you are coming. She shook her head. I sent a telegram, but I do not know if she received it. I have not seen Aunt Margaret in 5 years. My parents both passed last year, and I had nowhere else to go. The loneliness in her voice resonated with something in Dominic's chest. He knew what it was like to be alone, to have nowhere to belong. That was why he had come to these mountains in the first place, fleeing a life in Pennsylvania that had felt like a noose tightening around his neck. He had been barely 17 when he headed west, following the promise of gold, but what he had found instead was a peace he had never known in civilization. The mountains did not care about his past, did not judge him for the father who drank himself to death, or the mother who worked herself into an early grave. Up here, a man was measured only by his ability to survive, and Dominic had proven himself more than capable. Sierra City is 2 days' walk from here, he said. Longer in winter. You will need to stay here until you are strong enough to travel. Penelope looked around the cabin, then back at him. I do not want to impose. You are not imposing. You nearly died today. You need rest and food and warmth. I have all three. She bit her lip, clearly uncomfortable with the arrangement but also practical enough to see the necessity. Thank you, Dominic. I will try not to be too much trouble. No trouble, he said, and meant it. There was something about this woman that intrigued him beyond the simple fact of her near death. She had a strength to her, despite her fragile appearance, a determination in those green eyes that spoke of someone who did not give up easily. She had fought her attackers, had kept walking even when most people would have simply laid down in the snow and waited for the end. That took courage. As evening fell and the cabin grew darker, Dominic lit oil lamps and insisted that Penelope take the bed. He would sleep on the floor near the fire, wrapped in his buffalo coat that he had retrieved from where it still lay draped around her shoulders. She protested, but he was immovable on the point. You need proper rest, he said firmly. The bed is yours as long as you are here. She finally relented, burrowing under the blankets with a sigh of exhaustion. Dominic watched as sleep claimed her almost immediately, her face relaxing into peaceful lines. He sat by the fire, keeping it fed throughout the night, watching over her like some kind of guardian beast. It had been a long time since he had shared his space with another person, even longer since that person had been a woman. He found he did not mind it as much as he thought he would. Morning came cold and clear, the winter sun painting the snow outside in shades of gold and pink. Dominic was already up, having slept only a few hours in the restless way of a man unused to houseguests. He had coffee brewing and was frying salt pork when Penelope stirred, sitting up slowly with a groan. "How do you feel?" he asked, not turning from the stove. "Like I was thrown from a moving stagecoach and left to die in the mountains," she said dryly, then winced. "Sorry, that was not very gracious of me. It was honest." He plated food and brought it to her where she sat on the edge of the bed, still wrapped in blankets. "Eat. You need your strength." She took the plate gratefully, and they ate in companionable silence. In the morning light, Dominic could see her more clearly. She was indeed pretty, with delicate features and that striking blonde hair that would probably be quite lovely when it was clean and brushed. But it was her eyes that held him, intelligent and observant, missing nothing about her surroundings. "Have you lived here long?" she asked between bites. 15 years. Built this cabin myself when I was 17. Her eyebrows rose. "You have been alone up here all that time." "Mostly. I go into Sierra City every few months for supplies, trade furs and game. But yes, mostly alone." "Do you not get lonely?" Dominic considered the question. "Sometimes, but I prefer the company of mountains to the company of most men." "Most men," she repeated. "Not all. There are a few decent people in this world. They are just rare." Penelope nodded slowly, understanding in her eyes. She had clearly had her own experiences with the darker side of humanity. They finished breakfast, and Dominic insisted on checking her injuries again. Her feet were better today, the cuts clean and starting to heal, though she would not be able to walk far for several days at least. Her hands, too, were recovering, the color back in her fingers. "You were very lucky," he said as he rewrapped her feet in clean cloth. "Another hour and you would have lost toes at minimum. I know. I kept thinking about just stopping, just sitting down in the snow and closing my eyes. It would have been so easy, but something in me refused to quit. I am glad something did." The words came out more intense than he intended, and she looked at him with surprise. He cleared his throat and stood, suddenly uncomfortable. "I need to check my traps. Will you be all right here alone for a few hours?" "I will be fine. Thank you, Dominic." He nodded and gathered his gear, pulling on his buffalo coat that still smelled faintly of her now. Feminine, and somehow floral despite everything she had been through. The scent followed him out into the snow and stayed with him as he made his rounds, checking the trap lines he had set throughout the forest. He caught 2 rabbits and a fox, good furs that would trade well in town. The work was familiar and meditative, but his mind kept drifting back to the cabin and the woman waiting there. It was strange having someone else in his space, strange but not unpleasant. The cabin had felt more alive this morning than it had in months, warmed by more than just the fire. He found himself hurrying through his work, eager to get back, and that realization stopped him in his tracks. He had been alone for so long by choice, preferring solitude to the complications of human relationships. But something about Penelope Zimmerman made him want to return home, made him want to hear her voice and see those green eyes light up when he walked through the door. Dangerous thoughts for a mountain man who had built his life on isolation. When he returned to the cabin, Penelope had managed to make her way to the table and was sitting there wrapped in blankets, looking through one of his few books. She glanced up when he entered, and her face broke into a genuine smile that hit him like a physical blow. "You have a copy of Ivanhoe," she said, holding up the worn volume. "I love this book." "My mother gave it to me before I left home," Dominic said, hanging his coat and laying out his catch on the work table. "It is the only thing I still have from my old life. It is a good thing to have." She watched as he began skinning the rabbits with practiced efficiency. "You are very skilled at that." "I have had a lot of practice. These furs will bring good money in Sierra City." "Is that what you do? Trap and hunt, mostly?" "Sometimes I work as a guide for hunting parties or prospectors who do not know the mountains. The work suits me." She was quiet for a moment, then said, "I have been thinking about those men who attacked the stagecoach. If they are still out there, they will do this to someone else." "I know. When you are well enough to travel, we will go to Sierra City together and report it to the sheriff. If you can identify any of them, there is a chance they can be brought in." "What if they come here? What if they are looking for me?" Dominic looked up from his work, his dark eyes hard. "Then they will learn what a mistake that would be." There was something in his voice that made Penelope shiver, but not from cold or fear, from certainty. She believed absolutely that this man could protect her from anything, and that belief settled something that had been trembling inside her since the attack. The days that followed fell into a rhythm. Dominic would rise early and tend to his traps and hunting, always returning by midday. Penelope grew stronger each day, her body recovering from the ordeal with the resilience of youth and good care. She insisted on helping around the cabin despite his protests, cooking meals and organizing his somewhat chaotic shelves. They talked in the evenings by firelight, sharing stories of their lives. Penelope told him about growing up in Sacramento, the daughter of a shopkeeper and a seamstress. Her childhood had been modest but happy, filled with books and dreams of adventure. Her father's death from pneumonia had devastated the family, and her mother had followed 6 months later, her heart simply giving out from grief. Penelope had tried to make it alone in Sacramento, but without family or connections, decent work was impossible to find. Her aunt's offer had been a lifeline. "I was so hopeful on that stagecoach," she said one evening as they sat by the fire. "I thought this was my chance to start over, to build a new life. And then those men appeared, and suddenly I was fighting for my life instead." "You will still have that chance," Dominic said. "Sierra City is a good town. Your aunt's boarding house will do well. You will be safe there." Something flickered across her face, an emotion he could not quite read. "Yes, safe." Dominic told her about his own past, though he had shared these stories with very few people. His father had been a violent drunk who took his frustrations out on his wife and son. His mother had worked her fingers to the bone trying to keep food on the table while his father drank away every penny. When she died, Dominic had been 15 and already planning his escape. 2 years later, he made it happen, heading west with nothing but the clothes on his back and his mother's book tucked into his shirt. "I thought I would find gold and get rich," he said with a self-deprecating smile. "Instead, I found these mountains and realized I had been poor in ways that had nothing to do with money. Up here, I am wealthy beyond measure." "I can see why you love it," Penelope said, looking around the cabin. "There is a peace here, a simplicity. It is not an easy life. Winter is harsh, and there are times when I go days without seeing another soul. But it is honest. The mountains do not lie or cheat or hurt you for entertainment. Unlike people." "Unlike some people," he corrected gently. She smiled at that, and Dominic felt his heart do something strange in his chest. Over the past week, he had found himself noticing things about Penelope that had nothing to do with her recovery. The way she hummed while she cooked, soft melodies that filled the cabin with music. The way she laughed at his dry observations, a bright sound like water over stones. The way her hair caught the firelight and turned to gold, and how her eyes seemed to see right through him, to something he had not known was there. He was falling for her, and the realization terrified him. Dominic Harlow had not planned on caring about anyone. His life was settled, solitary, exactly as he wanted it. But Penelope was changing everything simply by being here, by existing in his space and making him remember what it was like to want someone's company. He found himself lingering over breakfast just to hear her talk, found himself returning from his traps earlier each day, found himself lying awake at night listening to her breathe, grateful for the sound of another heartbeat in his home. This could not last. She would heal, and he would take her to Sierra City, and she would begin her new life. He would return to his cabin and his solitude, and everything would go back to the way it had been. Except he knew now that nothing would ever be the same. 10 days after he found her, Penelope was well enough to walk around the cabin without pain. Her feet had healed remarkably well, though she would carry small scars. Dominic knew it was time to discuss the journey to Sierra City, but he found himself putting off the conversation. Just one more day, he kept thinking. One more evening by the fire. One more morning watching her smile over coffee, but practicality won out. They were running low on certain supplies, and Penelope needed to get to her aunt before the woman thought she was dead. On the 11th evening, Dominic broached the subject. "You are healing well," he said. "Well enough to travel if we take it slow. We should leave for Sierra City in 2 days if the weather holds." Penelope's hand stilled on the shirt she was mending for him. 2 days. Yes. "The journey will take us 2 full days of walking, maybe 3 if we need to rest. I will go with you all the way, make sure you reach your aunt safely." "Of course." Her voice was strange, flat in a way it had not been in days. "That makes sense. Penelope." He waited until she looked at him. "Is something wrong?" She set down the mending and stood, walking to the window to stare out at the snow-covered forest. "No, nothing is wrong. You have been more than generous with your time and hospitality. I cannot ask for more." "That is not what I asked." She was quiet for a long moment, her shoulders tense. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "I do not want to go." Dominic's heart lurched. "What?" "I do not want to leave here, leave you." She turned to face him, and her eyes were bright with unshed tears. "These past days have been the happiest I have had in years. I wake up every morning grateful to be alive, and it is not just because you saved me from freezing. It is because of you. The way you are kind without making a show of it. The way you listen when I talk like my words actually matter. The way you make me feel safe for the first time since my parents died." He stood slowly, his powerful frame unfolding from the chair. "Penelope, I know I should not say these things," she continued, the words tumbling out now like a dam had broken. "I know you have your life here and I am just some woman who stumbled into it by accident. But I cannot leave without telling you that these days with you have meant everything to me. You are a good man, Dominic Harlow, the best I have ever known." Dominic crossed the space between them in 3 long strides, and before he could think better of it, he cupped her face in his large, calloused hands. "You think I want you to go? You think I have not been dreading this moment since you were well enough to stand?" Her eyes widened. "What?" "I have not been able to stop thinking about you," he said roughly. "About the way you make this cabin feel like a home instead of just a shelter. About the sound of your voice and your laugh, and the way you look at me like I am something more than just a man who lives alone in the mountains. I know it is madness. I know we barely know each other. But I feel like I have been waiting my whole life for you to walk into it, and now that you are here, the thought of you leaving is unbearable." "Then do not make me leave," she whispered. "Let me stay. I can help you with the trapping, the hunting. I can cook and clean, and I am a hard worker, I promise. I do not need a fancy life in town. I just need to be where you are. Your aunt is expecting you. She is probably worried sick. We can send word. Let her know I am safe and have found employment elsewhere." Her hands came up to cover his where they still cradled her face. "Please, Dominic, I am asking you to let me stay." He wanted to say yes more than he had wanted anything in his life. But he forced himself to be practical, to think beyond the desperate wanting that consumed him. "Penelope, you do not know what you are asking. Life up here is hard, isolated. There are no other women for miles, no society, no comforts. Winter is brutal. Sometimes we would be snowed in for weeks at a time. Can you truly see yourself living like that?" "Yes," she said without hesitation. "I can see it so clearly it hurts. I see us working side by side, building a life together. I see quiet evenings by the fire and cold mornings wrapped in furs. I see a real partnership, the kind my parents had. I see home, Dominic. For the first time since they died, I see home." His resolve crumbled. With a sound that was half groan, half surrender, he pulled her close and kissed her. She melted into him with a soft sigh, her arms wrapping around his neck as his encircled her waist. The kiss was everything he had been denying himself for days, fierce and tender and full of promise. She tasted like hope and new beginnings, and he knew in that moment that he would never let her go. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Dominic rested his forehead against hers. "Are you certain once you make this choice it will not be easy to unmake it?" "I am certain, more certain than I have been of anything." "Then stay," he said. "Stay with me. Be my wife. Build a life with me in these mountains. I cannot promise you an easy road, but I can promise that I will love you with everything I have for as long as I draw breath." "Yes," she breathed. "Yes to all of it." They kissed again, longer this time, learning the shape and taste of each other. When they finally settled by the fire, Penelope curled into his side, his buffalo coat draped over both of them like a blessing. The coat that had saved her life, the coat he had given her without thought for his own safety, now wrapped around them both as they planned their future together. "We will still need to go to Sierra City," Dominic said practically. "You need proper clothes for mountain winters, and I should buy you a ring. We can find a preacher to marry us proper." "How romantic," Penelope teased, but her smile was radiant. "I am not a romantic man," he warned. "You gave me your coat in the middle of winter and told me you would love me forever. That seems fairly romantic to me," he chuckled, the sound rumbling through his chest where her head rested. "I suppose it does." They left for Sierra City 3 days later, both of them riding the mule Dominic used for hauling supplies. Penelope sat in front of him, secure in the circle of his arms, wearing his buffalo coat over the layers of warm clothing he had cobbled together for her. The journey that should have taken 2 days stretched to 3 as they took their time, stopping frequently to rest and simply enjoy being together. Sierra City was a bustling mining town nestled in the mountains, busy even in winter with prospectors and merchants and all the chaos of frontier life. Dominic led Penelope straight to the boarding house run by Margaret Zimmerman, a sturdy woman in her 50s who took one look at her niece and burst into tears. "Thank God," Margaret gasped, pulling Penelope into a fierce hug. "Your stagecoach arrived empty with blood on the seat. The driver was found dead on the road. We thought you were dead too." "I nearly was," Penelope said. "These men attacked us, threw me out in the mountains. I would have died if not for Dominic." Margaret turned to look at the mountain man properly, taking in his impressive size and rough appearance. Her eyes narrowed slightly, protective. "And who is Dominic?" "Dominic Harlow, madam," he said respectfully, removing his hat. "I found your niece freezing in the mountains. Took her to my cabin to recover." "You have been alone with him in the mountains." Margaret's voice rose sharply. "He saved my life, Aunt Margaret, and I am going to marry him." The boarding house went silent. Margaret stared at her niece like she had grown a second head. "You are what?" "Marrying him. I love him and I am staying with him." "Penelope Zimmerman, you have known this man for 2 weeks, 13 days, Penelope corrected with a smile. "And I know everything I need to know. He is good and kind and brave, and he makes me happier than I have ever been. We came to town to marry properly and buy supplies, but we are going back to his cabin together." Margaret looked between her niece and the mountain man, clearly seeing the determination in Penelope's face and the protective way Dominic stood beside her. Finally, she sighed. "You are just like your mother, stubborn as a mule. Are you at least going to have a proper wedding? If we can find a preacher, yes. Father O'Brien is at the church. Go see him. But Penelope, are you absolutely sure about this? More sure than I have ever been about anything." Margaret studied her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Then you have my blessing. But you," she pointed at Dominic, "you hurt her and you will answer to me. Understood?" "Understood, madam, though I would sooner hurt myself." They found Father O'Brien at the small Catholic church at the edge of town. He was a cheerful Irishman who asked few questions and agreed to marry them that very afternoon. Word spread quickly through the small town, and by the time the ceremony began, the church was half full with curious onlookers who wanted to see the mountain man and his unlikely bride. Penelope wore a simple blue dress borrowed from her aunt, and Dominic had bought a new shirt for the occasion, though he still looked more wilderness than civilization with his long hair and rough beard. But when he took Penelope's hands and spoke his vows, his voice was steady and sure, and there was not a woman in the church who did not sigh at the devotion in his eyes. I, Dominic, take you, Penelope, to be my wife. I promise to provide for you, protect you, and love you for all my days. You brought light into my darkness, and I will spend my life making sure you never regret choosing me." Penelope's vows were just as heartfelt, her voice shaking with emotion. "I, Penelope, take you, Dominic, to be my husband. You saved my life, and now I give it to you freely. I promise to stand by your side, to be your partner in all things, and to love you with everything I am. You are my home, wherever you are." Father O'Brien pronounced them husband and wife, and when Dominic kissed his bride, the church erupted in applause. They spent the rest of the afternoon stocking up on supplies, including a heavy wool coat for Penelope and a simple gold band for her finger. Margaret insisted on hosting a small dinner at the boarding house, where Dominic was thoroughly interrogated by his new aunt-in-law and found to be acceptable, if unconventional. They also stopped by the sheriff's office to report the stagecoach robbery. Penelope described the men as best she could, and the name Reese was enough for the sheriff to promise he would investigate. It would not bring back the dead driver, but perhaps it would prevent future attacks. As the sun set over the mountains, Dominic and Penelope began the journey back to their cabin. Penelope rode in front of him as before, but now she wore a gold band and his name, and her new coat was warm enough to withstand anything the mountains could throw at them. Still, Dominic noticed she kept his buffalo coat draped over her shoulders, unwilling to part with it. "You know you have your own coat now," he said with amusement. "I know, but this one is special. This one saved my life. I saved your life. By giving me this coat, I want to keep it." A reminder of the day everything changed. He pressed a kiss to the top of her head. "Then it is yours. I never planned to take it back anyway." The journey home took 3 days, and they made love for the first time under a canopy of stars with the buffalo coat spread beneath them and the wool coat covering them. Dominic was gentle and patient, mindful of her inexperience, and Penelope gave herself to him with trust and joy. Afterward, they lay tangled together, watching their breath form clouds in the cold air. "No regrets?" he asked quietly. "Not a single one." Winter deepened after their return, and the newlyweds settled into married life with surprising ease. Penelope proved to be an apt student of mountain living, learning to cure meat, tan hides, and even shoot with the rifle Dominic insisted she carry whenever she left the cabin. She had a natural skill with animal tracking and often accompanied him on his shorter hunting trips. The cabin that had been merely functional under Dominic's sole occupancy transformed under her care into something that truly felt like a home, with curtains on the windows and herbs drying from the rafters and the constant warmth of a well-tended fire. They were snowed in for 3 weeks in January of 1879, and rather than feeling trapped, they reveled in the forced intimacy. Dominic taught Penelope to play chess using a set he had carved years ago, and she taught him to dance, humming waltzes while they spun around the small cabin. They talked for hours about everything and nothing, learning each other's minds as thoroughly as they had learned each other's bodies. "You miss it?" Penelope asked one night as they lay in bed, tangled together under a mountain of furs. "Civilization, being around other people." "No," Dominic said without hesitation. "Everything I need is right here. Not everything. You need food, supplies, medicine sometimes. Those are things. What I need to be happy, to feel complete, that is all you." She kissed him softly. "You have a way of saying exactly what I need to hear." "I only speak the truth." Spring came slowly to the mountains, melting the snow inch by inch and revealing the world beneath. Penelope discovered she was pregnant in April, and Dominic reacted with a mixture of joy and terror. The nearest doctor was in Sierra City, hours away, and childbirth was dangerous even in the best circumstances. "We could move to town," he offered, though the words clearly pained him. "Make sure you have proper care." "No," Penelope said firmly. "This is our home. Women have been having babies in the wilderness since the dawn of time. We will be fine. You do not know that. I know that I trust you, and I trust us. We will figure it out together." They made the trip to Sierra City in May, ostensibly for supplies, but really so Dominic could talk to the town doctor and Margaret about pregnancy and childbirth. He memorized everything they told him, asked 100 questions, and bought every medical supply the doctor recommended. Margaret promised to come stay with them when Penelope's time drew near, and that eased some of Dominic's fear. The summer of 1879 was golden. Penelope bloomed with pregnancy, growing round and healthy and more beautiful every day in Dominic's eyes. They spent long days fishing in mountain streams and picking wild berries, storing food for the coming winter. Dominic built an addition onto the cabin, creating a separate room that would serve as a nursery. He made a cradle from pine and lined it with the softest furs he had. "You are going to be a wonderful father," Penelope said, watching him work. "I hope so. My own father was not much of an example. Then you know exactly what not to do, and you have something he never did." "What is that?" "Love. Real love, the kind that makes you want to be better." He set down his tools and pulled her into his arms, mindful of her belly between them. "I love you more than I knew it was possible to love anyone. You and this child are my entire world." Margaret arrived in October, huffing and puffing from the long journey, but determined to be there for her niece. She stayed in the new room while they waited for the baby to come, and Dominic found himself grateful for her presence, despite his usual preference for solitude. She was a practical woman who did not waste words, and she clearly loved Penelope deeply. The baby came on a cold November night, born into his father's strong hands with his mother's stubbornness. A boy, healthy and loud, with his father's dark hair and his mother's green eyes. They named him Daniel after Penelope's father, and Dominic cried when he held his son for the first time, overwhelmed by the fierce protective love that crashed over him. "He is perfect," he whispered, looking from the tiny baby to his exhausted wife. "You are perfect, thank you." "Thank you for giving me this life," Penelope said, tears streaming down her own cheeks. "Thank you for finding me in the snow. Thank you for giving me your coat." Margaret stayed through December, helping Penelope recover and teaching her the intricacies of caring for a newborn. When she finally left after the new year, she extracted promises that they would visit more often and that she could see her great-nephew regularly. The years that followed were full and rich. Daniel grew strong and healthy, a mountain child who learned to walk by pulling himself up on the cabin walls and learned to talk by imitating his father's low rumble. Penelope gave birth to a daughter in 1881, a tiny thing they named Delilah, who had her mother's blonde hair and her father's serious demeanor. Another son followed in 1883, Peter, who was all smiles and mischief from his first breath. Dominic expanded the cabin twice more, adding rooms as their family grew. He taught his sons to hunt and trap, passing on the skills that had kept him alive for so many years. Penelope taught her daughter to read and sew and shoot, determined that she would be able to survive anything the world threw at her. The children grew up wild and free, learning to navigate the mountains as easily as their father, but grounded by their mother's warmth and wisdom. They went to Sierra City several times a year, visiting Aunt Margaret and buying supplies. The townspeople grew accustomed to the sight of the Harlow family arriving on their mules, the massive mountain man with his beautiful wife, and their brood of healthy, happy children. Dominic never became comfortable in town, but he tolerated it for Penelope's sake, knowing she needed the connection to her aunt and to civilization. The buffalo coat that had started everything hung by the door of the cabin, still used on the coldest winter days, but more often serving as a reminder of how their story began. Penelope would sometimes press her face into its worn fur and remember the day she had been sure she would die, only to have this incredible man appear and offer her not just his coat, but his entire life. The children grew and eventually started families of their own. Daniel married a girl from Sierra City and brought her to live on the mountain nearby, building his own cabin with his father's help. Delilah married a prospector and moved further west, promising to write often and visit when she could. Peter became a forest ranger, using his mountain skills to help others navigate the wilderness safely. Dominic and Penelope grew old together in their cabin, their bodies slowing but their love only deepening with time. They watched grandchildren arrive and fill the mountain with noise and laughter. Dominic's hair turned silver but remained long, and Penelope's face gained lines but never lost its beauty in his eyes. On a cold December evening in 1910, exactly 32 years after Dominic had found her shivering in the snow, Penelope sat by the fire wrapped in the buffalo coat that had started everything. Dominic sat beside her, his arm around her shoulders, both of them watching the snow fall outside their window. "You ever wonder what your life would have been like if those men had never attacked the stagecoach?" Dominic asked. Penelope considered the question. "Sometimes. I suppose I would have made it to Aunt Margaret's, worked in the boarding house. Maybe married eventually, someone suitable and boring, had a comfortable, ordinary life. Do you wish for that sometimes? The comfort." She turned to look at him, her green eyes still bright despite her age. "Not for a single second. That would have been a half-life. This, what we built together, this is real, raw and difficult and more wonderful than I ever dreamed possible. You gave me more than your coat that day, Dominic. You gave me a reason to keep fighting, to keep living. You gave me love and partnership and a family and a home. You gave me everything." He kissed her softly, a kiss that held 3 decades of devotion. "You gave me just as much. Before you, I was just existing, surviving. You taught me how to truly live." Their grandchildren arrived the next day for the Christmas celebration, filling the cabin with chaos and joy. Dominic watched his sons and daughter, his grandchildren, all healthy and happy and loved, and felt a satisfaction deeper than any he had known in his youth. This was what mattered. Not gold or wealth or status, but family, love, legacy. As the years continued to pass, the story of how Dominic and Penelope met became family legend, told and retold to each new generation. The tale of the mountain man who gave away his coat in the middle of winter, and the city girl who chose wilderness over civilization for love. The buffalo coat itself became an heirloom, carefully preserved and passed down, a tangible reminder of the day their family truly began. Dominic Harlow lived to be 85 years old, still strong and vital until the very end. He died in his sleep in the winter of 1931, in the cabin he had built with his own hands, surrounded by family, with Penelope holding his hand. She followed him 6 months later, unable to exist in a world that did not contain him. They were buried side by side on the mountain they had loved, under twin pine trees that had witnessed their entire story. Their children and grandchildren continued to thrive, carrying forward the lessons of strength and love and resilience that Dominic and Penelope had taught them. The cabin remained in the family, maintained and cherished, a shrine to the love story that had started there. And the buffalo coat stayed with it, hung by the door where it had always been, a reminder that sometimes the smallest acts of kindness can change everything. The story of Dominic and Penelope became more than just family history. It spread through Sierra City and beyond, a tale of true love and survival that people told around campfires and kitchen tables. The mountain man and his lady, some called them. Others referred to them as the coat couple, though that always made their descendants laugh because it reduced such an epic love to a single garment. But perhaps that was fitting in its way. Because it had started with a coat, with a man who saw a woman freezing and gave her what she needed without thought for himself. And from that single act of compassion had grown a love story for the ages, a partnership that had weathered every storm and come out stronger. Decades later, great-great-grandchildren would visit the old cabin, now a historical site maintained by the family, and they would see the buffalo coat still hanging by the door. They would hear the story of how their ancestor Dominic had found Penelope shivering in the snow and had wrapped her in that coat, had carried her to safety, had fallen in love with her by firelight. They would learn how Penelope had chosen the hard life of the mountains over easy comfort in town, because she knew that real happiness was not about luxury, but about being with the right person. And they would understand, in whatever small way children can understand such things, that love was not always grand gestures and sweeping declarations. Sometimes it was as simple as giving someone your coat on a cold day and meaning it when you said they could keep it forever. The mountains of California stood eternal, watching over the graves of Dominic and Penelope Harlow as they had watched over their lives. The cabin remained solid, the coat remained preserved, and the love story remained alive in every descendant who carried their blood. They had built something that transcended their own lifetimes, a legacy of devotion and partnership that would inspire generations yet unborn. In the end, Dominic had been right about one thing. He had told Penelope on the day they met that he preferred the company of mountains to the company of most men. But he had found in her the exception to every rule, the one person whose company he would always crave more than solitude. And Penelope, who had been so certain she was going to die alone in the snow, had found not just survival but true life, the kind that made every hardship worth enduring. Their story was complete, whole, a narrative with a beginning in terror and cold that had transformed into something beautiful and warm and lasting. From the moment Dominic had heard that scream echoing through the forest to the moment Penelope had closed her eyes for the last time with her hand in his, their lives had been intertwined in a way that felt almost destined. The buffalo coat had never been just a coat. It had been a promise, a commitment, a symbol of everything that would follow. Dominic had given it freely, expecting nothing in return, and had received in exchange a lifetime of love. Penelope had accepted it gratefully, not knowing she was accepting so much more than warmth. And neither of them had ever regretted a single moment of what came after. This was their story, complete and whole, a love letter written across decades and etched into the very mountains they had called home. This was how a single act of kindness had blossomed into forever. This was how two lonely people had found each other in the vast wilderness and had built something that would outlast them both. The mountain man had found her shivering without a coat in winter. He had given her his and had never taken it back. And in return, she had given him her heart, her life, her everything. It was a fair trade, they both would have said. The best deal either of them had ever made. A love story for the ages, born from buffalo hide and winter cold and the kind of compassion that changes the world one person at a time.